Good evening and welcome to Andrew's property session this evening in Keynsham Civic Centre. Delighted to see so many faces here this evening, and I'm sure you're all looking forward to an excellent value evening where we can learn more about legal aspects of letting your property from one of our partner solicitors from Burrows Day. The Andrews group of companies operate from Keynsham, and tonight we are represented by our colleagues from Estate Agency, Lettings, Land and New Homes, Leasehold as part of our group consideration. We've also got our surveyors here as well this evening, so any questions related to all aspects of our property services can be asked this evening. These property sessions started about 2 years ago, and this is actually the 57th property session that we've run for our landlords. They're always very well attended, and attendees go away with lots of new information to help them run their property investments. Tonight, we're delighted to invite Benita Walters from Burrows Day Solicitors, who will be talking about some of the key aspects of letting your property from a legal aspect. Recently, there's been a lot of changes to lettings law from the 1st of October, and Benita will be able to tell you all about those changes to help you manage and maintain your property investment. The key areas that she'll be covering this evening will be around tenancy basics, the actual controls around the properties, particularly in connection with quality, and of course the tenancy termination, which is important when you want to get possession of your property. We'll be having a question and answer session later in the seminar, where you'll be able to ask any relevant questions about your own property considerations. For those of you that are watching from home, can you please post your relevant questions as soon as possible so we might be able to ask those questions at the end of the session. The session will last between about 40 and 45 minutes, and at the end of the session we will go offline, and those in the room this evening will be able to ask any relevant technical questions with the experts in the room. So please may I welcome Benita to the stand to give her presentation for the clients here this evening. Thank you.
I hope you can all hear me. Good. I'm Bonita Walters from Quality Solicitors Burrows Day. I hope you have all heard of us. If you haven't, I'm shocked. We have been around since 1829 when Benjamin Burrows set up a law practice in Bristol. And we have come a long way in the last 200 years. We now cover all major areas of civil laws for businesses and individuals. So if after this evening, if you have got any questions about any aspects of law at all, we're always happy to have a chat with you. Do give us a call at any time, and we're always happy to have a chat with you over the phone and give you some pointers free of charge. This evening, I'm going to cover the essential basics and your obligations as landlords, both during and before the tenancy, the steps that you can take to minimize the chances of things going wrong with your letting and to maximize the chances of regaining possession of your property if things don't go to plan. And lastly, I'm going to run through the legal requirements for terminating a tenancy and the court process for regaining possession. As we go along, I will touch on the new and pending legislation that you need to be aware of. I expect that many of you would be familiar with the letting process, and some of you might have letting or managing agents to do everything for you. But ultimately, you are the landlord and you need to know the ins and outs of lettings. And I might speak about scenarios that you haven't had the need to think about, but there's no harm in knowing what to do in case it happens to you. If you take all the right steps, and if things go wrong, you will stand a much better chance of getting things sorted without incurring too much time and costs. And I thought that the best way to go through everything is to go through each stage of the letting process. Pre-tenancy, getting consent. If you have a mortgage other than a buy-to-let mortgage or a leasehold property, remember to get consent from your lender and from the management company. You should also check with your insurance company to make sure that your policy will continue to cover after the property is let. Landlord's license, this may or may not apply to you, but properties in selected areas are required to get a license from the local council before it is let. For instance, Easton in Bristol is one of those areas. And we know of a landlord and his managing agent who didn't get a license for his 5 properties, and he was fined £1,000 per property by the council. You can check with your local council to see if your property needs a license, or Google the landlord licensing scheme for more information. Landlord's insurance. Think about whether you or not you want to take out landlord's insurance to cover tenants' default or breach of other terms of the tenancy. It is an additional expense, but not. A few years ago, I have to sort out a landlord whose tenant turned the house into a cannabis factory. And apart from the cost of eviction and the rent arrears, she has incurred about £30,000 of cost to put the property right again. But luckily, she has landlord insurance to cover the rent arrears and the eviction cost. And I was able to recover the rest of the losses from the letting agent because there's a negligence aspect to that case. Energy performance certificate and gas safety certificate, I expect you will be familiar that you need to have that and provide them to your tenant before the start of a tenancy. The how to rent prescribed information, this is new. Since 1st of October 2015, you must supply this document called How to Rent, the checklist for renting in England, to your tenant at the start of the tenancy. You can get a hard copy or an email copy from the Department of Communities and Local Government website. Just Google www.gov.uk. Smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarm, I expect all of you would have heard about it. From 1st of October onwards, you must have a smoke alarm on each floor of the building, and you must have a carbon monoxide alarm if there is a solid fuel appliance in the property. So, for instance, a wood burner or an open coal fire. Now, gas boiler is not covered by the new legislation, but because it can also emit carbon monoxide, my advice is if you have a gas boiler in the property, install a carbon monoxide alarm as well. Fire safety and electrical safety, it is not an absolute requirement, but you must make sure, because as a landlord you have an obligation to make sure that everything in your property is safe. So make sure that all your furniture and furnishings are fire retardant. I would say at the very least provide some sort of fire blanket in the kitchen. And of course check that all your electrical appliances and all the wirings are safe. Immigration check. A pilot scheme has been running in the West Midlands where landlords have to check that their tenants are in the country legally. this is going to be rolled out to the rest of the country. I don't have the timescale yet, but it is going to happen. And you can check the tenant's passport or the national ID card, residence card, or certificate of registration or naturalization. If you look on, again, the gov.uk website, you will find a full list of acceptable documents in a code of practice provided by the Home Office. It is called the Right to Rent Immigration Checks Landlords Code of Practice. Now, at the start of the tenancy, get to know your tenants. Obviously, I expect everybody will take references. But on top of that, do your homework. The internet is a very good source of information. Facebook, LinkedIn, Companies House website, and the Insolvency Register are all very useful free sources of information. Think about why your tenants are renting. What are their personal circumstances? Do they have a secure income to meet the rent? And make sure that you read the reference. I have come across very recently a landlord who let out several properties, and he told the agent to go and get reference and get guarantors. The agent didn't do it, but he didn't check it either. So he ended up being out of pocket for about £20,000 when the tenant walked into the sunset after they left. Guarantors. Not many lettings will have guarantors, but if you do have guarantors, make sure again you check them out. You will be surprised how many guarantors will come across are non-existent or have no money, no asset to the name. One very simple check that you can do is to search the address on the land registry website. If they own the property they live in, then you know you'll stand a better chance of recovering money from them should you need to. The tenancy agreement, this is obvious, I don't need to elaborate, but we have seen a lot of tenancy agreements that are either unsigned or have the wrong date on or have some vital information missing. Just be careful. And in case you are not aware, the unfair terms in Consumer Contracts Regulations 1999 applies to tenancy agreement. So essentially anything that tips the rights and obligations of the parties will be considered unfair terms. So if, say, you try to shift the repairing obligations or put a time limit on your tenant notifying you of any fault, if you charge high interest or slap on penalty for late payment, then all these could be considered unfair terms, so you need to be careful. The Office of Fair Trading has a very good guidance on how the regulations apply to tenancy agreements, if you want to know more. And then a break clause. If you have, sorry, I missed out the tenant's belongings. Tenant's belongings first. Think about having a clause saying what would happen to the tenant's belongings that are left in the property after they left. Your tenant is unlikely to leave anything valuable behind, but if they do leave behind a pile of belongings, technically you will be a bailee of those goods under the Torts Interference with Goods Act 1977. And you will have to take all kinds of steps before you can finally dispose of the goods. Having a suitable clause in your tenancy agreement would strengthen your position if you get any hassle from your tenant about goods that they left behind. And break clause. If you have a longish fixed term, you might consider putting in a break clause allowing you or your tenant to break the tenancy if things don't work out. Of course, you still have to give a minimum of 2 months' notice. and you still have to serve a Section 21 notice in order to break the tenancy, and I'll come to that a little bit later. Protecting the deposit and serve prescribed information, you should all be familiar with that. That must be done within 30 days after you've taken the deposit, and you won't be able to serve a Section 21 notice to end the tenancy if you don't protect the deposit. And you can leave yourself open to a claim by the tenant for return of the deposit and a penalty of up to 3 times the value of the deposit. At the start of the tenancy, of course, take inventory. Your letting agent will probably see to this. Take photographs and get it signed and dated. I would also suggest that you test the smoke alarm and the carbon monoxide alarm with your tenants and get your tenant to sign to say that they are working at the start of the tenancy. And obviously take meter readings, make sure the council tax is put in the right name, leave the operation manuals for the appliances in the house. And managing agent's contract. If you use a managing agent, make sure you know who is going to do what. You know, for example, who is going to deal with maintenance and safety checks? Who is going to issue a copy of the certificates to your tenant? Who is going to deal with any changes to the law, like the introduction of the smoke alarm and carbon monoxide alarm? And who is going to keep records? And during the tenancy, always keep a record of all rent received. It is not just for tax purposes, but if your tenant falls into arrears and you have to seek possession, the court would want to see your rent record. Also keep a record of everything in connection with the tenancy. It is always better to have a written record of all the exchanges with your tenant so that later on there can be no argument about who said what and when. Even if you have a verbal discussion, it is always good practice to follow this up with a summary in writing and keep a copy. And of course you have to do the periodic inspection, maintain the property, carry out annual safety checks. When the initial fixed term expires, you and your tenant may want to continue with the tenancy. Most people will sign up to a new fixed term, but it is not essential. If you don't sign up to a new fixed term tenancy, the existing tenancy will simply continue on the same basis. And if you do need to serve a Section 21 notice to end the tenancy, that is the normal method to end the tenancy. And if the tenant doesn't move out after the notice has been served and the notice period has expired, you can just start the possession proceedings. But the Deregulation Act this year have introduced a number of changes. These changes apply to all tenancies starting on or after the 1st of October this year. But in 3 years' time, by 1st of October 2018, it will apply to all tenancies. The first change is time restrictions. For tenancies beginning on or after 1st of October this year, you will no longer be able to serve a Section 21 notice within the first 4 months of the tenancy. And in the case of a replacement tenancy or continuation tenancy, the relevant period is 4 months from the start date of the original tenancy. And once you have served a Section 21 notice, it has a shelf life of 6 months from the date you served the notice. You must issue possession proceedings if your tenant doesn't move out within 6 months. In other words, you use it or lose it. And under the old rules, if you serve a notice to end the tenancy after the fixed term, the notice that you have to give must be no less than 2 months' notice ending on the last day of a tenancy period. And this was where a lot of landlord and managing agents fall down by calculating the wrong termination date. But this is now no longer a requirement. All you have to do is to give a minimum of 2 months' notice. But you must still be careful that the notice is no earlier than 2 months from the date you serve the notice, and it is always good practice to leave a bit of leeway and add a few more days to allow time for the notice to reach your tenant, so that there can be no argument about short service. And rent refund. When a Section 21 notice is served and the tenant then moves out in good time, all the rent that has been paid that covered the period after the tenant has moved out must be refunded to the tenant if it is more than 1 day's worth. That means a tenant who has paid the rent for the notice period can leave early and have some of the money back. If you are in breach of any of your obligation as a landlord, you will not be able to serve a Section 21 notice, and this is any obligations at all, including providing your tenant a copy of the How to Rent booklet. And if a tenant makes a complaint about the condition of your property, you must respond in writing within 14 days, saying what you're going to do about it and within what time scale. If your response is not satisfactory, or if you fail to respond at all, your tenant can complain to the local authority, and the local authority can then inspect. And if the local authority then serve an improvement notice on you or carry out urgent remedial work, then any Section 21 notice that you have served would be invalid, and you will also not be allowed to serve another Section 21 notice for 6 months. These sort of changes obviously will have ramifications for landlords, because you may get more technical complaint about the condition of the property. And I guess what is likely to happen is if you have a difficult tenant who is also in rent arrears, you're more likely to use a Section 8 to evict the tenant rather than just serve a Section 21 notice. Go back a bit. A Section 8 notice is normally used when your tenant is in rent arrears or in breach of other tenancy terms. Unlike a Section 21 notice, a Section 8 can be used during the fixed term, and the notice period is 14 days as opposed to 2 months for a Section 21 notice. There are 17 grounds for the court to grant you possession under Section 8. Some of the grounds are mandatory and some are discretionary, which means that it is up to the court to decide whether or not to give you possession. Rent arrear is a mandatory ground, and the court must give you possession if you fulfill the legal requirements. But there are drawbacks. With a Section 21 notice, provided that possession is all you want, you can use the accelerated possession procedure. It can be dealt with as a paper exercise, and so long as your tenant doesn't put up a defense, then you will get a possession order. it is quicker and it is cheaper. With the Section 8, you can start possession proceedings sooner, but the tenant must be in rent arrears, no less than 2 months rent arrears when you serve the notice at the time when you start possession proceedings and on the date of the hearing. So if you get a tenant who just managed to bring the arrears down just below 2 months, you will not be able to get an outright possession order. I will speak a little bit more about this later. A Section 8 procedure is also more expensive because there will always be a court hearing. And how quickly you can get a court hearing would depend how busy the court is. There are also more preparations to do. We have to do witness statements, proof service of the notice, and get up-to-date arrears figures. Although with the Section 8 claim, you can also claim judgment for rent arrears. But in practice, a tenant who is either unwilling or unable to pay will just walk off into the sunset after the eviction. You are unlikely to be able to get any money back off the tenant. Most of the time, you wouldn't know where they have moved to. And in practice, with nearly all the possession cases we dealt with, the landlord is just seeking possession rather than rent arrears. So whether you use Section 21 or Section 8 will depend on your circumstances, and I have done a little comparison table between the two notices. Generally, if you have a tenancy that's still got quite a long period to run, or if you think that your tenant won't be able to pay off any of the arrears or concoct any defense or make a counterclaim against you, then use a Section 8. Otherwise, use a Section 21. But what about if your tenant is in breach of other terms of the tenancy? Mainly, most of the breaches are discretionary grounds, and I would always say use a Section 21. Don't rely on the court exercising its discretion to grant you possession. And if you do find yourself having to evict a tenant, what can you expect? Well, firstly, you have to take them to court, either under Section 21 or Section 8. You will have to pay a court fee. Currently, it's between £250 to £280, depend whether you are issuing on paper or whether your claim is one that could be issued online. There are discussions about increasing it to somewhere between £325 and £355. So watch this space. It is still under consultation. Seeking possession through the courts is not a quick fix. If you use the accelerated possession, and if all goes smoothly and all your paperwork and apple pie order, then that is the quickest and cheapest way to gain possession. You can be looking at anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks from start to finish. But if your court action is one that needs a hearing, for instance, if it's started under Section 8, or if your tenants put up a defense that the court will want to hear, then there will be a hearing, and it will take longer. Could be take anywhere between 6 to 12 weeks. Again, it's dependent on how busy the court is. And if you make a Section 8 claim and your tenant managed to reduce the arrears to below 2 months, the process will take longer. However, persistent rent arrear is a discretionary ground for possession. So you can try asking the court for a possession, for a discretionary ground possession order. It would just mean that you may not get a possession order because the court can exercise its discretion and refuse. Alternatively, you can also see if the court is willing to grant you a suspended possession order, so that if your tenant's rent arrears were to accumulate again, you don't have to go back to court. You can go straight to the bailiffs if your tenant doesn't move out. I would add that if there's anything about your claim that needs looking into, for instance, if your tenant claims disrepair, then your claim is very likely to be adjourned. That is why at the outset I advise you to keep good records about everything in connection with the tenancy, so that if your tenant does put up a defense, you will stand a better chance of seeing off the tenant and answer the points raised in the defense if you keep good records. And if there's a court hearing, there will obviously be a lot more preparations. And most landlords at this stage would instruct solicitors to represent them. And we will do all the preparations for you and represent you at the hearing. If you are successful in getting a possession order, you can expect the court to give you possession within 14 days. The tenant can apply for an extension for up to 42 days, but this is very, very rare. More often than not, if you have to go as far as going to court to get possession, your tenant is not going to leave until the bailiffs knock on the door. Currently, the fee for bailiff's warrants is £110. When you apply for a warrant, the bailiff will fix a date and time for possession, and then they will come to the property. You need to be there on the day with a locksmith, so that as soon as the eviction has taken place, you can change the locks to prevent the tenant from going back in. The tenant can appeal or sometimes apply to adjourn the eviction, but this is again very, very rare, and it rarely succeeds. Lastly, before I finish, I want to say a few words about surface, because quite often this is where most landlords fall down. Always allow time for surface. If you think your tenant is going to be tricky, then if it is practicable, serve the notice yourself in person, go to the property and put it through the door. Take someone with you so that you have a witness, and make a note of the date and time of surface. Alternatively, you can serve by first-class post. If it is not returned by the post office, that means it is posted and delivered, or you can use track delivery. But if you use recorded delivery, then just be a little bit careful, because if your tenant is tricky about it, he won't sign for it. And so the notice, they can say that they have never actually received the notice. And I would emphasize that most tenancies go without a hitch. But if you have any questions or concerns about your tenancy at all, just give us a call. We have a specialist service for landlords which is broken down into different stages. You can instruct us to check your tenancy agreement, prepare and serve the notice, issue possession proceedings, do all the preparation, and represent you at the hearing. You can use us for the whole process or just for part of it. It is all done on a fixed fee, so that you will know exactly what we're going to do for you and how much it's going to cost. And if you are going to sell or buy a property, if you Google Quality Solicitors Borough Estate online. We have a conveyancing fee calculator, and by putting in the price, it will show you exactly what the legal fees are going to be and what the disbursements and VATs are going to be. So you know exactly what you're going to pay. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and let me pass you back to David Westgate for the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I'd like to invite Paul Bumford to come and join me here for the question and answer session. Paul Bumford is a Managing Director of Andrews Mortgage Services. And Benita, if you'd like to join us again, please, for the question and answer session. First of all, I'll take questions from the floor. So if you'd like to put your hand up if you have a question, and a microphone will be passed to you. Gentleman up the front, please.
There should be something in your tenancy agreement to say that tenant has to allow you access to carry out various checks like annual safety gas checks. And you are also allowed to enter the property yourself to carry out emergency work. And if your tenancy doesn't allow you in, write to them. Explain why it is important for you to carry out those checks and why you need to be there. And if you tried it several times and your tenant still won't allow you in, then you have a record of what happened, that you explained everything to them and you're better protected. Generally, your tenant should tell the post office that they have moved and have the post redirected. But I would say it's not the same as belongings left in the property. Sometimes your tenant ought to have a forwarding address as well. You might be able to find it through the deposit scheme.
Any other questions from the floor, please?
If you have a clause in your tenancy agreement to say that you can serve by email and your tenant will accept service by email, then it is fine. But otherwise, I would use other methods of service.
Any more questions, please? Okay, can we take the question on the floor first, please? Okay, so I'll read a question we've had fed through from the internet here, from Michael. I've seen on a recent TV programme that many landlords are using the High Court in order to get earlier possession for rent arrears recovery. Can you please advise on this?
I have to say I'm not entirely sure what you mean by using the High